Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Rachel Jamison Webster and Dr. Melissa Blount. Thanks for joining us tonight. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 300 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. Rachel Jamison Webster is a professor of creative writing at Northwestern University and the author of 4 books of poetry and cross-genre writing. She has taught writing workshops throughout the National Urban League, Chicago Public Schools, Gallery 37, and the Pacific Northwest College of Art, working to bring diversity and anti-racist awareness into creative writing curricula. Webster's essays, poems, and stories have been published in outlets including Poetry, Tin House, and the Yale Review. Benjamin Banneker and Us is her first nonfiction book. Joining her is Melissa Blount, who is an artist, writer, and licensed clinical psychologist practicing her craft in Evanston, Illinois. Her textile pieces explore notions of Black womanhood, trauma, and white supremacy in America. She often works with antique household linens as a canvas to reshape and reimagine the narratives around Black women and domesticity that are deeply woven into the fabric of our country. FAN is proud to own one of those pieces. She cultivates unique opportunities for people to contribute to these conversations through community sewing circles and public actions. And now let's welcome Rachel Jamison Webster and Melissa Blount.
Lonnie, thank you so much. Thank you to all the people at FAN. That list of authors is just incredible to me. So many of my favorite authors have given a FAN talk, and I just have so much gratitude and respect for this series and the kinds of ideas you share to make us better citizens and family members and community members. So thank you. And Melissa, you are one of the deepest thinkers and most profound artists I know, and I'm just so excited to be in conversation with you. Thank you.
I feel the same way, and I can't wait to get this conversation started. So, all right, let's dive in. Okay, why should we know about Benjamin Banneker? I mean, I grew up knowing that he plotted out Washington, D.C., but that's the extent. And you just have such a beautiful and profound way of communicating his importance to America and, history. So can you just talk a little bit about why he's such a significant figure?
Definitely. So Benjamin Banneker was born in 1731 in Maryland, and he was born as a free person of color. His parents, his mother Mary had recently been freed from indenture, and his father Robert had escaped and eventually bought his way out of enslavement. So Benjamin came into this family as a free person of color, and he was completely curious and excited about learning his whole life. So his friends said that his joy as a child was to dive into books. So here was a child who took his freedom as the freedom to know his own mind and keep learning and reading. And so as a young man, Benjamin designed and built his own clock out of wood. He was sort of known as a local scientist and intellectual, but he wasn't really on the map because it wasn't very safe for him to leave his land. As you can imagine, this was a time when slavery was ramping up. Things were becoming unsafe even for free people of color. But he continued learning and achieving. And then later in his life, he started doing astronomy, and he predicted an eclipse, and he started writing almanacs, and then he was invited to help survey Washington, D.C., and he was hired by Jefferson and Washington to do that work and paid for his work, which makes him the first Black man to be paid by a federal commission in this country. And when he got home from the survey, and at this point he's 60 years old, he got home from the survey and he decided to write another almanac to have it published. And he wrote an enclosure letter to Thomas Jefferson. And it's an extraordinary document. You can find a link to it if you go to my website, but it's a real document. in which he totally called Jefferson out on his hypocrisy. So he started quoting the Declaration of Independence back to Jefferson and asking him to reflect and saying, how could you be so aware of the value of freedom for yourself and still detain my people in cruel oppression? And so it's this extremely brave letter where he really calls out the founding fathers for creating this country on the ideal of freedom and continuing to enslave people. So those are some of his achievements. I think that he's one of those people who we all should know about. I think he is just a historical figure who gives a lot of hope because of the way he continued learning, and he really changed the parameters of what was possible for his life.
Okay, so the part that I'm most, intrigued by is this fact that, and I lovingly tease you about this, but when I first read your book and I called my mother and I was like, Mom, my good friend just found out she's Black. It's just like, how many white people find out that they're Black? And so what did that mean for you to find out that you had this connection to this, just extraordinary human being, but in our country, our history, being a person of color, being a Black person is still very fraught.
Yeah, yeah. So I found out during 2016, which was this fraught season in this country. It was election season, we all remember, and I felt like the narrative of what it meant to be in America, to be American, was really up for revision. And so all of a sudden, I was at a cousin's wedding, and one of my cousins had done ancestry and had been doing a lot of genealogical research, and found through my grandfather's line that there were generations of people who were listed with an M beside their name for mulatto at the time, or multiracial people. So these went back several generations, and it went to the Lett family. This ancestor was named Susan Lett, and then they connected to Jemima Lett, who was Benjamin Banneker's sister. So through that, we could see on paper how we descended from this amazing family. So I was fascinated. I didn't feel an inner sense of shock, I have to say. I actually felt a sense of alignment of like, oh, that explains something, some feeling. So I wasn't shocked, but I was already a writer, and I was discovering this set of stories that were absolutely extraordinary. And I started thinking, wow, this is sort of a metaphor for the country. The way that my family passed into whiteness and lost track of generations of African American ancestry, artistry, activism, and genius is actually like a microcosm of what happened in our country. The whole country did that in their origin stories, because my family knew we had been here since before the revolution. I felt like, invested in what the ideals of this country, even though I'm perpetually disappointed by this country. I felt American, and yet I didn't realize how much generationally we were also African American. So I was really interested. I started kind of obsessively doing research, but I didn't know how to work with the story ethically, especially at this moment. As a white person, how do you write a story about Black excellence as an outsider? And those questions of who gets to tell what story are important questions, because the seed of them are about white exploitation of Black intellectual property, of Black stories, of Black genius. So I sort of paused. I did a lot of research, and I wrote a tiny essay called White Lies and Fiction, which is basically saying what I just said, and naming some of the ancestors. And 2 years after I published that essay, my cousin Edie Lee Harris was looking up one of those ancestors named Aquila and came across my essay online and said, "Who's this writing about my family?" and looked me up, realized that I was a relative, and found me on Facebook. And Edie wrote to me and said, "We need to talk about our family." And as soon as I started talking with Edie, I thought, okay, this is how it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a conversation between me and my cousins, my African-American cousins who have carried this history, and between the past and the present, because I felt like I was seeing all these patterns repeat in the present.
Can you say more about that? Like, and how you mentioned a little bit, and let me pause for a second and just make a clarification that I'm teasing Rachel about finding out that she's Black. Rachel is not going around claiming that she is now a Black woman. So I just don't want anybody writing in the fan or putting in the chat about you now saying that you are in fact Black. But I do think it's curious about how, or not curious, powerful, the fact that your family, knowing that you have been in America, you said prior to revolution,
Mm-hmm.
and that you have this significant forefather, but that ancestry was let go. How did it feel to know that there was a point in which your family said, we are laying down that claim and moving on to this kind of identity or this being in the world? Like, what did it feel like to find that piece of the story out? And I'm also curious about how accepting Edie was, that she said to you that we have to talk about our family. It seems like she immediately embraced you as a family member.
Yeah, she was so generous. And I was close to tears in that moment. So for me, it felt like there had been this rupture that I didn't even know we had in the family. And when I met her, I felt such familiarity. We started talking on the phone, and our first conversation was 2 hours long, and it was like we were asking the same questions. There was a welcome. I was also very grateful. So Edie then introduced me to the other cousins who become really important to the book, Robert Lett and Gwen Marable, and then her brother, Edwin. And I would say always I was thankful to them for what they shared with me. And I wanted to always acknowledge that I was an outsider. And I was being generously admitted into research, into oral history, into the stories. So I had a lot of shame, I would say, around the passing part that in some ways they helped me with. At the same time, we had conflicts that are bound to happen when you're working across racial lines and you're working with really tender family stories. So it's not, you'll see in the book, it's not all roses, but there was a moment where Robert said to me, we kind of understood when family members did that because your life was entirely different if you could pass. You could get jobs. You could own property. It was a whole different range of what was possible because of the racist laws that were set up in the country all along. And one really exciting thing about having this ancestry, because Benjamin became famous in his lifetime, people recorded his ancestry. So we can go all the way back to the 1680s with the family, which means you can go back to the beginning when they were tracing race in law. when it
Mm.
didn't actually have to go the way it did. The working class was multicultural, multiracial. They were working side by side. And race was introduced as a way to divide the working class and make poor working white people feel aligned with the landowners through racism. So that's a case where I saw the same thing happening again. I'm seeing it again now. But there is a really personal, emotional side to this book, which is about my own quest, my own humility in the quest, awareness of what I don't know,
Mhm.
and questioning of why my family lost track of their relatives and lost this.
Mhm. Yeah, you know, as a professor, you know, words matter, and the thing that's striking to me is, you know, there was a loss, but there's also an intentional, you know, choice that was made to say, hey, we want to be able to have access to not only, you know, these opportunities and land ownership, but the seat of power too. And that really comes through in the book. And so I wonder, has there been any discussion amongst white family members about, you know, hey, this was a choice we made, in a sense of advocacy, or you know, that kind of parallels the sense of advocacy that, say, Gwen talks about, or, you know, that these folks were like, hey, we're fighting for our rights to be recognized as human beings and to have rights. Education is like such a big part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm
It's
not
such,
sure if that's clear, but I do wonder what kind of conversations have been started or are yet to be discussed amongst, you know, your white family.
Mhm. I've been really surprised. A lot of people have come to readings around the country, white relatives meeting Black relatives for the first time.
Mm.
So a lot of the readings in the last year have become reunions, and it's been really beautiful to see this. So I think that the book, it functioned as a deep human education for me to write the book. And my hope is that it functions as that for readers as well, including readers in my own family. And I
Mm.
think it has been that, because a lot of the book is, you know, my cousins who are collaborators telling me about their lives. And so it's that very important aspect of the white person who holds the power, really, frankly, listening, and really trying to learn from people's lives, both in the past and in the present. So I think that there has been some of that going on, you know, in my extended family in terms of people coming out. It's been pretty remarkable, and not always people that I would expect to be coming out, you know, and celebrating this, and have still done it. So that has been good to see. And some, like you said, education is important in the book. One of the stories that fascinated me first from the family is this story. So after Benjamin Banneker, there were generations, a couple generations in Maryland. And after the revolution, a lot of Black folks and people of color thought that the revolution would mean freedom. Because
Mm.
how could you be spreading the word about freedom and
Mhm.
not actually act on it? So
Mhm.
there was a huge movement around abolition that was then dashed. And actually, sort of like what happened in Reconstruction, things got really bad for people after the revolution, right when they thought they'd be getting better. And so
Mhm.
the family had to leave Maryland, went into Ohio, which had originally promised to be the new Northwest Territory and have freedom for any landowner, regardless of race. Well, they got there, and then the white neighbors started just attacking. The family bought 1,000 acres with allied Black families. So they had a huge holding.
Please say what year this was that they bought 1,000 acres.
Isn't that amazing? In Southern Ohio, this is from the 1820s to the 1840s, and they would go and bring more family members and add on. And they were helping on the Underground Railroad. They were really activated people, really strong families that we still have reunions with these families. So they were allied families, amazing. And they were pioneers, they had gone west, they were building their houses, they were self-sufficient, teaching their children how to read. And the legislator in Ohio started to knock holes in those laws. And then the surrounding townspeople started to terrorize them. So they had been sending their kids to school. And the sheriff came in and demanded that the kids be pulled out of school because they were the N-word. And the school teacher refused to identify the children, which also shows how how you couldn't even
How ridiculous it was.
How ridiculous it is. Exactly. So the school teacher said, no, we won't identify the children. And then Margaret, this little girl, Margaret Lett, he said, aren't you one of them? And she said, no, I'm as white as you are. So you see that is how it begins a lot of the time. It's like, you're not going to take a law away from me. And so you end up claiming you're something you're not, in a way.
Yeah, that was a powerful, it was painful and comedic at the same time, because I just can only imagine that these idiots march into this school and are like, these children need to be taken out, but they can't even identify who the kids are. I mean, just the idiocy of all of this is heartbreaking. And Margaret at that time would have been how old?
12.
So you have this 12-year-old little girl standing up to these terrorists.
Exactly.
In that moment. She seems emblematic of the badass women in your family. Can you talk more about them and how just remarkable their story? I know Benjamin is just this extraordinary person, but what really jumps off of the page is how extraordinary and brave the women in your family were, starting with Molly.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, one of the cool things about Benjamin being famous in his lifetime was that people took the time to record his family stories. So I realized I had an in to write about his family and the women more than we often get. And I really wanted to write the book going through the generations. So it was not just a great man narrative, but that it really looked at the context of the family. So it begins with his grandmother, Molly, who was a dairymaid in England. She would have been a teenage working girl. She was probably orphaned because that was usually the case. And she was convicted of stealing a bucket of milk. And at that time, you could be sentenced to hang for that kind of crime. You could be sentenced to hang for theft of something worth $8 to $15 in today's money, because there were so many poor working young people in England that they were kind of trying to get rid of them. So the story is that she was sentenced to hang, and in court, she pled the book, which meant that she said she could read the Bible. It was rare to be literate. And because she could read, that sort of put her in a different category as being part of the church. And so she got this lesser sentence of indentured servitude in the New World. So she was a convict servant, which was really, it was really looked down upon, low class, not respected. They were sort of considered expendable laborers, and especially the women. So that's how she arrived in Maryland in the 1680s. And then she would have married Banneker, who was an African man from Senegal. And so those are the grandparents. Their daughter was Mary. That is Benjamin's mother. And while we were working on this book, new documents surfaced about Mary. We already knew that she was an herbalist. She was an entrepreneur. She made food and sold it to the men at the mill. And she was also a local healer. So she made salves and medicines, and she knew a lot about plant medicine and midwifery. So she was an important community member.
To white and Black people, right?
Probably, but there were in that community, they had a whole context of free people of color or people who were affiliated with the Quakers. And so there was a little more, I think that I learned in school a very monolithic idea of enslavement. And this was before big plantation enslavement. And so you had these communities. They were in a community of free people of color. But yes, she was selling food to white working people. She was in the community in all ways and really respected. And the document that surfaced is her arguing before the provincial court for the freedom of her daughter from indenture. And she calls the indenture laws against children repugnant. I mean, she's beautifully articulate. She's angry. She's fierce. And it totally foreshadows the way Benjamin would be later with Thomas Jefferson. So I really wanted to celebrate these strong women who were literate. They were healers. They were community members. They raised strong families, and they were just pretty amazing.
Yeah, I'm struck by what you were saying about how everything is kind of cyclical. And so can you talk a little bit about how these indentured servants and free people were using the laws to their advantage to gain freedom and amass wealth and land and that kind of thing. And it seems like that began to bother the white men, and then all these laws started to change. And then that's what, right? Tell me, because I might be getting it messed up, but that's what Mary was fighting against, because her kids were supposed to be freed, right?
Right. So this is so early in the country that they were basically setting the legal groundwork for slavery. So the first group of laborers, it was mostly white indentured servants. And then they started wanting to have enslavement for life based on race. And so the laws started to change. Like law had always had lineage going through the father. They changed it to go through the mother, because then you could have white enslavers impregnating their enslaved women and getting more property. So it's really horrifying to see how this was all set up and written into law. So Mary was indentured for 31 years, which would have been the most of most people's life then, just because her father was African and her mother was British. So her great crime was being born a mixed race person. So that means she was held in indenture. And if you got pregnant while in indenture, your children were indentured, and often they extended your own. So they were really writing the laws of slavery through women's bodies. And so Mary stood up in court like the month she was free, she went to the provincial court to argue for her daughter Sarah's freedom. Sarah was around 16, and she knew if Sarah stayed in indenture much longer, she would be impregnated because you couldn't protect yourself very well. And it would be a lifetime sentence. So it becomes a lifetime generational sentence. So she was really fighting for the rights of her children, but particularly for her daughters, because she knew firsthand what was happening to women in these situations.
So can you please tell the fan audience that, that she won?
Oh, yeah, she won her case. Thank you. Ah, thank you for reading the book so closely. There's a lot going on in this one. She won her case.
Fascinating.
It's amazing. Yeah. And just she had the courage to stand up in court.
Mhm.
And, the weird thing was I wrote the book doing a lot of research, benefiting greatly from generations of my cousin's research. And I also used a pretty intuitive meditative process. And early on, I would have this like vision of a scene of her being in court and almost feeling herself out of body, like looking down on herself, being afraid, and yet knowing this is what I have to say.
Mhm.
And a friend of mine who's a lawyer said something once about like the legal record, even if you didn't win your case, it preserves what should have happened. Like someone who's brave enough to stand up in court and say, these laws are repugnant. We should be ashamed of what we're doing to children. Just the courage that takes.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, and we can see on our DNA, because now we have all the documented research, but we also have these DNA links that we have a lot of cousins linked to these children that Mary had earlier.
Wow. Wow. That is so powerful. Do you what would you think? And maybe we have to save this for the after hours, but I just keep thinking, what would Mary and her daughters think about what's happening now in 2024, centuries after she fought and won in court, for her. Yeah, I'm even stumbling over my words because I just cannot believe we're talking about this in 2024, that women's rights are once again being shrunk. What Because you did have a spiritual kind of conversation, like an ancestral communion of sorts, do you have any idea or sense of what would she think about today?
Yeah. Yeah, I thought about that a lot as I was getting toward the end of the book. And I just kept thinking like, they would be so disgusted that we're still here. We are still fighting for the right to tell the truth about our history, to share stories of Black genius, for women to have autonomy over their bodies and their children, and when they decide to have children. I just felt like, oh, Molly and Mary would be sort of disgusted and shocked. Because this was 1731 when she stood up in court and argued. Molly married Banneker in 1690, around there, maybe 1696. And then it was said that she raised her children with the African traditions. So she was a person who grew up in England and it wasn't a surprise that she could fall in love with an African man and raise her family to respect both traditions. Like, why do we act now like this isn't possible? It's just kind of staggering and really upsetting.
Yeah, and it points out once again how high the stakes are, and that people are seeking not only to shrink people's uh, autonomy over their own bodies, but to seize power. And the stakes are really, really high. Okay, I don't want to get off because we got some more to talk about, but let's go a little bit back to the passing piece of the book. And we were talking before this conversation about what were the benefits of passing, and then what were the breakages. What were the things that were just I just get an overwhelming sense of grief, as for the white members in your family who did make that choice to pass, that the power and value of whiteness was so much more of a choice in this country, that they would relinquish that connection to Benjamin Banneker and Molly and Mary and women
and all the people who had the Let Homestead, who fought for their education, just really a lot of generations of really activated, smart people. Yeah, I think I felt that grief, which is why I felt the relief of reconnection. Why it felt so deep when I met my cousins and I was invited sort of into the stories, and I was invited to learn from their stories. And the funny thing is, when I told my cousin Nathan was the person who first told me about the ancestry. We were just talking at this rehearsal dinner for my cousin, and he mentioned it. And he's also the one who said, don't go acting like this makes you Black. Like he really warned me early on of he was like, I can see you're really excited right now, but you need to calm down and not go out there. And so he was he was on to my enthusiasm, but he was giving me a really legitimate check and warning, like only your first cousin or your siblings can do.
Right.
My brother, they call me out. My brother's like, wow, it's really something at this moment in time to be claiming a connection to Black genius. Isn't that a little obnoxious? So they were my good, calling me out. But honestly, when I told Nathan about Edie and saying, we need to talk about our family, he had tears just fill his eyes in the same way it was an involuntary, immediate response that you can't fake. I could see that he felt it the way I felt it. It was a deeper thing. It was a more personal thing than we ever realized, basically.
Yeah, was it sort of like a wound that you didn't even know? Yeah,
exactly. It was a missing. It was like I had been missing my cousins my whole life. And I didn't know it until I met them.
Wow, that is so powerful. Can you tell me about, well, let me just say, there was one striking part of the book on page 133 that just speaks to the current level of stupidity with white folks around race, and know if I would call it, I'll be gracious enough to say unintentional harm that folks can inflict when we're talking about race and even class
Yeah.
issues, can you
Yeah.
read that piece of it and we can talk about it? Because
Sure.
this was a conversation you had with
Gwen.
Gwen, right? Okay.
Gwen is one of my cousins and one of my teachers in the book. I don't know if this will work. This is a picture of us in the woods near her retirement community where
Oh,
she lives. She is a beautiful soul and just one of my guides, really, one of my dear cousins and friends. And she's 91 years old and really conscious. And she has been sharing the Banneker story for years. And we got really close in this process. We would meet every other week on Zoom and talk through the history, but also she would share a lot from her own life. So we had been talking in this chapter. So this is Gwen speaking to me. And we had been talking about Molly, this white woman who married an African man. And this is Gwen. When I learned the Banneker story, I felt such a sense of relief that I was not only this way because of a white massa. I felt, well, isn't this interesting that it's not just a white man that is making our family light-skinned. It's also a white woman, because Molly, of course, had her own story. She sure did, I said. So I'm finding that the Banneker story not only connects me to the Black origins of who I am, it also gives me the white piece that was missing too. This story relates to my personal journey of finding comfort with the color of my skin. I spoke about it just last week at the senior place where I live. Last Friday, I was sitting outside with 10 of my neighbors, and one woman who I don't know very well was also there. We got into a conversation about color, and she asked me why I had not chosen to pass for white. Wow. I felt unsteady in my chair suddenly. Yes, it kind of caught me off guard, Gwen said. I don't know why I didn't say, why are you asking me that question? Later, I realized it was really all about her. She was feeling like, oh my God, I would never want to be Black. She was essentially asking me, why would you choose to be Black? So I told her the story of my father, who could have passed as a white man, as many of the people in our family did during World War II in order to get work. There were good government jobs available to them in Washington, D.C. if they would just leave Ohio and become white. They did come back to Ohio for family reunions, but eventually, after they got married, they usually stopped visiting. Eventually, they kind of disappeared. Anyway, I got into telling that whole story and then saying, because my father was my model, I never would have passed. You know, if my father had chosen to pass as white, then maybe, but there was never a time when I would have wanted that. I would have been so nervous living with that as my choice. And in fact, because of growing up, I didn't tell the woman this at the time, but now I'm reflecting on it with you. Because I grew up in the colored community of Cincinnati, I was surrounded by Black history and Black excellence. I grew up in the time of segregation, the Great Depression, World War II, and there was great pride in our history and a lot of teaching in our community. From the time I stepped out my front door and walked several blocks to the Black-owned drugstore to get my ice cream cone, every porch along the way had people sitting on it who knew my name, Gwen said. I knew that they would call my parents if anything was going on that shouldn't be. My father had great pride, but he was discriminated against because of his skin color, for not being Black enough or not being white enough. My father was a race man. That meant he was making a stand for the race, a stand for equality. It was his way of saying, I am Black and this is what I am fighting for in my life. But he was never able to do everything he was capable of, and that pain went very deep for me. I didn't even realize how deep it was to witness that as a child. But he was not the only one. There were college-educated Black men who were working on the railroad and glad to have that job. Even though they were lawyers and doctors, ministers, teachers, and principals, There were very few jobs for them. These stories are so important to share, I said. I can speak them now, and hopefully somebody will read them, Gwen replied.
Has this book been banned?
No. It's a lot of racial construction disguised as a triumphant biography. So maybe it could be, but no.
Okay,
No.
I think
A
we
lot
should
of
make that
honesty.
our goal. I think we should make that our goal. To get it to be in front of so many people that these idiots feel like it needs to be banned because, God, Rachel, I mean, what you've captured and the conversations, the nuanced and painful. I know sometimes the journey of writing this book has been painful. And we can talk about that in the after hours portion, but it just seems like this story reads like fiction. You know, it is so powerful. And the way, I really do want people to buy it and read it, because the way that you've written this history, your family's history, America's history, it reads like it's something that comes to life. Like the book feels palpable, like you can touch and interact. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. It's really engaging the way that you captured these conversations and facts.
Thank you.
It just feels deeply, deeply personal. And like, did this really happen? It feels like a fictional book, but I mean, I know it's not, but it reads like fiction the way that you've put the words on the page.
Thank you so much. It was a great honor to write this book and to work with my cousins, and I'll say to work with the ancestors, because I kept feeling like it was so much bigger than me. I would show up and do my best, but there was no denying that it was bigger than all of us as individuals, which is why we made it and us. We tried to make the frame. It's a very populated book, as you know. There are a lot of family members in it, both from the present and the past, because it's just more than us as individuals. So it was such an honor to just listen to Gwen, to learn from her, to learn from Edie and Robert, and also tell the stories of the Banneker family. Thank you.
I felt like I needed to take notes. I had such a hard time keeping up with lineage and every family member.
Well, I wanted a family tree in the opening, and for whatever reasons, it fell off, and the publisher didn't do that. So there's a family tree on my website. If anyone reads the book and gets lost like that, you can print it out. And it does help to just show the generations so that it's not just a tangle of people.
It's powerful. I had to do that recently, not to get off topic, but with the House of Dragons. I had to print out a family tree. But, one of the things, what do you want people to walk away with?
I would like people to walk away with humility in a way. Like there are so many stories left to be told. In terms of race, I would like us to acknowledge that we are related to one another. This multiracial family that I'm a part of is not really an anomaly. It is rare that we could have this much documentation, but it is not rare to have mixed ancestry in this country. What happened was a whole mythology around race rose up to deny the fact that we are deeply related, and there's all kinds of pain in the ways we're related. It goes back to ownership and sexual violence and stories that are really hard to unpack. But I think it's ultimately healing, to be honest about that, to look at that and to look at how racism still shapes things today, and sexism.
Yes, Lord. Yeah.
Sorry
So
to
do
leave
you,
it on a grim note, but
well, no, I mean, yeah, and this is the thing. When I got to the end of the book, I wanted more. Do you think that you'll have like a sequel, or what piece of it would you like to continue?
that's a great question. Thank you for wanting more. There are more stories. I mean, the book doesn't actually really get into that Let Homestead period in Ohio. And there's a whole chapter when my parents and I and my daughter went in search of Peter Let, who was the ancestor who left. And it turned out he was a laborer working with John Brown, the abolitionist, in a tannery where they would hide fugitives from slavery underground. So the tannery had hidden rooms underground, and then they would hide them in wagons and get them to boats to go across Lake Erie. And this is where I grew up, on Lake Erie. It was a big, important, the Western Reserve area for this.
Mhm,
And then
mhm.
other ones of our cousins were showing up in Canada. And so there's more to the story of the work of how people continued to try to find freedom or help others to freedom. And then, as you say, how other people, abdicated from all that and went for personal safety. There are more stories to tell, and it would be really fun. I feel that the past is very animated for me in a way.
Mm,
And so someday it would be great to have the time and to be able to immerse again in those slightly more recent ancestral stories.
mhm. Yeah, I think with the movement to squash and limit people's access to our history is very telling, because it is very animated. And it does, you can't help but read this kind of information and and powerful, painful storytelling and not be changed and moved. Like I don't know. Somebody would have to be very committed to their ignorance, which I guess we are seeing that deep commitment to ignorance. But
We
yeah,
are.
well,
But I mean,
I
that's
can't
what
wait.
reading should undo.
Mm-hmm,
That's
mm-hmm.
what reading and really connecting to characters who were real people, who just wanted to live. They just wanted their families to be safe.
Yeah,
Or they were tremendously courageous in what they were doing.
yeah.
I mean, there were so many activated people of color advocating for themselves. So the way even like abolition is also often talked about as like a white story,
Mm-hmm.
right? And certainly there were really important European American activists in abolition, but there were so many families of color working behind the scenes, under the radar, to help people.
Yeah. And I mean, and going before court. Like
Yeah.
I'm just shocked by the bravery of Molly and
Yeah.
Mary. Yeah. I mean that can't be overstated. There definitely needs to be a movie about that portion
Commitment.
of your story. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's badassery to like the 100th degree.
Really brave. I had to
Mm-hmm.
learn from them. I mean, I learned and I was so helped by them and their stories, because
Yeah.
I was pretty introverted and shy before this book came out. And then it was like, if they were brave enough to do that, I better be brave enough to give a reading.
For sure. Or to show up on a Zoom.
Right, right.
Like, I think you can do that.
Ladies, what a great last 50 minutes that we spent with you. I know people have been really, really touched by the story and the energy in between the two of you. Melissa, thank you so much for such a thoughtful reading of Rachel's work and for preparing for this and bringing your whole self here. I want to remind folks, we've been putting in chat ways that in case you're like, well, they keep talking about this after hours thing is another hour with these two, or 55 minutes technically, with these two incredible people. How do you get to come to after hours? It's a second Zoom that'll start at 8:05. We've been putting in links to buy a copy of Rachel's book from our partner bookseller. They will, in the email receipt that you get back from the bookseller, is the link to register for after hours. So that's how you get to come. Get to ask your own questions, turn on your camera, come have fun. There's been some pretty thoughtful questions that have been presented during the event. But I want to definitely thank you, Melissa. You know, I love you. I've known you for a while. I love your husband, love his work. You guys are such great supporters of FAN. I was actually looking through some old photos, saw some photos of you guys when you ran a little post-event workshop the first time we hosted Ta-Nehisi Coates at ETHS. And just a quick heads up, he has a new book coming out this fall in October, and don't be surprised if you see him again on that stage at ETHS, just letting a little cat out of the bag there.
Right.
I don't, but you know, I don't like to jinx it either, right? So I'm going to pose a quick question. There's a couple I could pick here. So I'm going to start dealer's choice here. I'll start with Gita's question because she is the person who connected us, Rachel. Which is she'd likes to know for you, Rachel, what would you like to see most as the legacy of your book?
Thank you, Gita. Conversations, I think, honest conversations that are ultimately healing conversations where people can share their truth. White people can listen to the truth of life for Black people in our country today and can learn about our history. So I'd love for it to just spark more conversation and more looking into history. I wanted to write the history I wished I had been taught. So this sort of quest to uncover what has been hidden from us is the other part.
Great, I do appreciate that. We have like 1 minute left, so you're gonna give us one quick little, though it's not a quick thing, and so we can expound a little bit more in after hours. And Ben Blount, I saw your question you just posed. That's a big question. It's gonna take longer. So I sent you a little after hours link, Ben, so you would just show up there and you can ask your question. But this is from Rahul, and actually this was presented in the registration form for Zoom. He or she asks, I'm sorry, I don't know gender, doesn't really matter. In our current climate, what must we center in order to further racial healing? Do you have a snapshot that you could give 1 point to folks about furthering racial healing?
I think we should center Black voices and humanity and really the fullness of our humanity. And I also really believe what I said before, our relatedness too. I think that our connectedness. So it's a fine line because there has to be great respect for the specificity of experience. But I think also acknowledging that we're more related than we've been led to believe.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. All right, we're at 8 o'clock. So folks, grab a copy of Benjamin Banneker, out in paperback now, I might add. This is actually, the book is now out in paperback, and I think actually the bookstall links to the paperback version. Come hang out with me and Melissa and Rachel. Come hang out at after hours. There's gonna be some chuckles there, I know. So thank you so much again. Hope to welcome folks to more FAN in the future, both in person and online this spring. And thank you so much. We'll see you in about 5 minutes at after hours.